everyone, and Happy New Year. BAPA and BenAmerica welcome all of you and our presenter, Scott Tinker, to our first webinar of 2021, Sustainable Energy for the 21st Century. During this year, we are planning to diversify more our webinars with technical topics of interest to our members and associates. Today's webinar will be moderated by Enzo Concha and Gabriel Hermon, who are members of our new team, BAPA Next Gen, which was incorporated with the objective of increase our membership base with younger professionals.
Many thanks, Carlos, for those introductory remarks. It is clear without energy, there is no chance of having any of the societal aspirations we are aiming for. For our rapidly increasing global population, accessing energy is fundamental activity that requires reliable and scalable solutions. Solutions that have to sustain through the test of time. Today, we have the pleasure of kicking off our 2021 webinar series with Dr. Scott Tinker and his presentation on sustainable energy for the 21st century. Scott's experience is well suited to provide us a picture of the challenges and opportunities ahead of us. You will find Scott working with a very demanding space, helping bring industry, government, academia, and non-governmental organizations together to address major societal challenges in energy, the environment, and the economy. Currently, Scott serves as a director of the Bureau of Economic Geology in Austin, Texas, but actively participates as a professor in the University of Texas, as a chairman of the nonprofit Switch Energy Alliance, which features two major films. You probably will have heard about the first film called Switch, about energy, and the second, most recently one, called Switch On, about energy poverty. This website, the website and resources it provides with these lines, provides also robust and free outreach content for education programs and energy subjects. Scott has also served as the president of different professional geosciences associations and with consulting roles for governmental agencies. As a public speaker, Scott has traveled across the world, over 65 countries and more than 50 keynote lectures. Your moderators today, Gabriel and I, will be collecting your questions from the chat function and delivering them to Scott during the Q&A session. You could post your questions in Spanish if you wish. Please keep your microphones muted and video cams off all the time. If time is not a concern at the end, we could select some of you to do your questions live. In that case, we will call your name. Please join me on welcoming Dr. Scott Tinker. Scott, you're welcome to take the floor from here.
Scott, thank you, Enzo.
Can you turn your camera on? Is it possible?
Me?
Yeah.
It should be on.
I don't see you. Do you see him, Enzo?
No, but it's okay. I mean, he can go with the presentation.
Don't worry, just put back the presentation.
Is it on now?
No. But don't worry, just put the presentation.
No?
Okay, it's on now. It's on now.
Okay. And now if I can get my presentation. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, put it on presentation mode. Perfect. Excellent.
Okay. Now you have me and the presentation. I feel sorry for you for me. The slides are much more attractive. It's good to be here with you, Enzo. Thank you for that nice introduction, and Carlos for the invitation to be with you today. I look forward to the conversation afterward as well. So I want to think about this word sustainable. It probably means different things to different people. So I'll try to define it right up front today. To me, there are three important pillars. Is it affordable? Both the cost and the volatility of the price, and that's to the consumer. Very important to me that we think about the price we pay for things. Is it reliable? Can I get to that energy 24/7, 365? And finally, is it environmental? The air, the atmosphere, the land, and the water, these are major pillars of the environment. And energy needs to try to be as clean as it can on all of those. So if we think big picture to start, These are some major issues in the world today, aren't there? I think we would all agree that these are important issues. And I'm highlighting some in orange now. These all relate to the economy and really in many ways to poverty. Our second film, Switch On, features energy poverty. And of course, energy sits here as a major issue in the world, as does climate change today. And we're often presented with a climate change or energy narrative. And I don't subscribe to that. I don't think it's either or. I think we have the land, the air, and the water as well. So when you think about these, it's really climate change and energy and the land and the air and the water. We have to try to optimize on all of these. The land, the air, the water, and the climate are all part of our environment. So it's about the environment, it's about energy, and it's about poverty, poverty being part of our economy. So it's really back to the 3 E's, environment, energy, and the economy. I've been talking about these for a long time. There are some overarching questions that I think we will cover today and perhaps come to near the end or in the Q&A, but I want to lay them out now. Is addressing energy poverty part of an energy transition? Do we need to think about that as part of a successful energy transition? What's the future of the global energy mix? How does COVID-19 impact our energy future? Are some electricity fuels clean and others dirty? What's the future of transportation? And finally, will eliminating fossil fuels actually clean up the environment? These are big questions, and if you think about it, they involve the economy, they involve transportation and electricity, and they involve the environment. So that's the overarching view today. So here we sit with energy, the economy, and the environment. The 4 pillars of the economy, of the environment: poverty, competition, and growth on the economic side, and fossil, nuclear, renewable energies. It's complicated though, isn't it? There's legal and social and political systems that wrap all this up. They're very interactive. You really can't separate them, and I call that overlap space there in the middle, the radical middle. It's radically lonely sometimes. It feels like nobody wants to really try to compromise or address these big challenges in the heart of all this. But that's where sustainability lies. Those are the big challenges in the world in that overlap space. So it leads us to an outline for today's talk. We'll talk about the economy, we'll talk about energy, and we'll talk about the environment in very relevant terms. So let's start with the economy. I'm going to really dive into the energy poverty side of this. Here's the people in the world today. The red colors are where it's very dense, and white is where not many people live. And I'm highlighting some of those white areas for us, and it makes sense why. As scientists and geoscientists, we understand why people don't live in these areas. Now, if we take a look at a different map of the world, one of global income, again, I'll highlight those same areas where not many people live, so they're gray here. You really can't calculate an income when there aren't many people. On the very low end of this, less than $1,000 per year, up to $4,000 per year. So that's maybe $10 a day of total income. That's the orange, the yellows, and the reds. And those exist everywhere in the world, but they're concentrated in certain parts of the world. And I've shown those in ovals here. And we made our film Switch On. We went to Colombia. We went to Kenya and Ethiopia, Nepal and Vietnam, and looked at different kinds of energy poverty. If you haven't had a chance to see that yet, I would encourage you to do that. It's on everywhere now, our website and YouTube and other places, but it really features these particular important challenges. Now, as we go up that economic scale, the $12,000 a year in the pinks and over $12,000 in the blue, that's still $1,000 per month on the low end of high. Those are focused here. You see the blue, it's quite limited actually where the wealthy nations exist today in the world. I put some geography on the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, 20 degrees north and south latitude, and come back into a different map now, a map of the world's temperature. And I've highlighted those areas again where not many people live. It's really hot or it's really cold, and that's why the population isn't very dense. Where is it wealthy? Oh, the temperature is just right. It's not too hot and it's not too cold. And poverty is focused in areas today that are quite warm. Okay, not many people live where it's very cold, but quite warm. So there's a warranted concern that 3 degrees C warming will hurt the world's poor. That's another 10% warmer than it is today. And they're struggling already in many parts of the world where it's very hot with climate. Now I come to a final map of the world, and it's this one at night. The lights of the world at night. A composite satellite image. It's spectacular if you think about it. Where are the lights on? Well, it's wealthy. Energy provides the economy and the economic wealth. It underpins that. You see, in fact, if you look at lights at night against the GDP per person, this is every country in the world. There's a very strong correlation between access to energy and wealth. I put those points of geography, 20 north and 20 south again. Where is it poor? There aren't many lights. There are some, and they're around the coast, but not much energy in the poor nations in the world today. So there's a warranted understanding that energy will help the world's poor. It will help with all the things that it helps the world's rich. So what does it mean? What does little to no energy really mean? Well, there are 3 kinds of people in the world: those who are good at math and those who are not. So which of the 3 are you? Here's some very simple arithmetic. This shows the kilowatt hour consumption per year in Ethiopia and other African countries. We featured Ethiopia and Kenya in our film Switch On. You may not speak kilowatt hour, so I'm going to compare that to my refrigerator. My refrigerator consumes 9 times more electricity than the average Ethiopian and 3 times more than the average Kenyan. Just one refrigerator. That's energy poverty. If you look at severe poverty across the x-axis in the bottom there, that's $3 a day or less, against how electrified is the country. In Latin America, we can see mostly electrified and about 10 to 20% severe poverty, and the size of the circle is proportional to population, with Brazil being the largest. At the same scale, here comes Asia. I mean, the population is just tremendously greater in China and India, and more poverty, less electrified, more poverty, and then over 1.1 billion people in Africa today, and again showing Kenya and Ethiopia, much less electrified and more poverty. So correlation is not causation, but there's a very strong relationship between poverty and access to electricity and coming out of poverty. It presents a paradox. Energy won't end poverty, but you can't get out of poverty without energy. And that's one of the great global challenges. So how many people live without much energy? Well, electricity access, it's 1 billion people in the world today. It's come down from about 1.6 billion 20 years ago, but still about 1 billion people. Now this map is a map of population. Every color is about 1.1 billion people today. All of North and South America are about 1.1 billion people, the equivalent that don't have electricity in the world today. How many people are cooking indoors with wood or biomass or dung of various kinds or charcoal? Turns out we feature this in our film Switch On, and this is Sanu Kanchi, who we spend a lot of time with, one of 2.5 billion people cooking indoors today with wood or biomass or dung of various kinds, 1/3 of the world. And that smoke kills 3 million people every single year. That's twice as much as COVID has killed this year, every single year. And it's so solvable, just from breathing indoor smoke and all the associated diseases that go along with that. Now, the extreme poverty rate has been coming down tremendously, from 18% down to about 8 or 9% in 2018, and it was forecast to go down to around 7% pre-COVID. COVID has changed that. Now, you see one forecast says it's going to flatten out and come back up. That's the World Bank. The UN says with about a 5% GDP contraction, which is what we will have this year, we'll see world poverty go back up to around 11% or even higher than that. And that's a couple dollars a day. That's a tremendous reversal of an otherwise good trend. And finally, if we look at GDP per person against electricity consumption per person, you can see about 15 or so of the big countries in the world. There's a very strong trend here. Back in 1990, The more electricity you consume, the wealthier you are per person. Now, let's shift forward 25 years, and you see the big countries, US, Austria, Germany, big economies, move to the right. They double their GDP per person without increasing energy that much. That's a good thing. Mid-range countries here, especially watch South Korea, they go to the right and up, more energy and more wealth. And finally, China and India, Brazil, I'm showing Mexico, Ecuador here in the lower left. Watch the change here. They start to shift up in energy some and over to the right, but still quite a bit different, and particularly India. So you see a different trend in 2015. You have to increase that energy to get wealth, and then it starts to roll over or flatten a bit. Now, we made a film called Switch, released it in 2012, and that featured energy. Energy was the star. It turns out we went and featured about 4 billion people in the world where there was energy. What we missed is about the 3 to 4 billion who don't have much energy, and that's what that second film is about. They want to do what the rest of the world has done, grow and industrialize and become wealthy. And they should be able to do that. Energy shouldn't limit that. And that's what this film Switch On is about. So we see 1990, 2015, and the potential for increasing our wealth without increasing our per capita energy consumption. That yellow line is really a goal or a target, if you will. And we're headed that direction, which is a good thing. But it's time to power the people. And we feature in Colombia, we actually bring first solar energy to a village called Gunchucua, where the Arhuaco people live on the Venezuelan border. Actually, it's the northeast corner of Colombia, right there on the Venezuelan border. So let's look at it. Primary energy by type. Here's coal in the world, and it's kind of plateauing. Here's oil, and there's natural gas growing tremendously. Now I add the nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, and geothermal biomass and everything else. The overall growth in energy is 375% since 1965. Now, coal and oil, foundational for electricity generation and transportation, have grown, but not as much as the total growth. In fact, the only ones that have grown more than total are natural gas and then some combination of hydro and nuclear and the renewables, which were very small in 1965, so it's hard to calculate their growth rates, but they're around 400%. If I look at that growth differently now by region, North America and Europe have actually been flat in consumption for over 20 years. This is primary total consumption, not per capita. Look at Asia. Gone from essentially nothing up to a tremendous amount. And the rest of the world combined, not that much. About the same as North America, all the rest of the world. And I've shown the Great Recession, which had a little dimple there in energy consumption. The growth again, 375%. Now by region, North America and Europe are much lower than that overall. The only ones that are bigger is Asia, 1,300, almost 1,400% growth. And then you see the Middle East growing tremendously, and South and Central America as well, and of course Africa. But again, starting from very small numbers. I come back to my global energy population map of the world in 2019, and this slide took me a long time to make. I analyzed a lot of data and have made this because I think it's important to understand. Here's the world's energy mix today, and it's 60% coal and oil still. Natural gas makes it 85% fossil fuels. 60% coal and oil today, 3% solar and wind, the yellow and the orange. Now let's look at that geographically. Here's North America. You see the demand has flattened about 20 years ago, and the mix is changing. So today the mix in North America looks like this. It's about 49% coal and oil and 4% solar and wind. If we go over to Europe, we see again a flat demand with coal going down tremendously and other things growing. In Europe, we see 50% coal and oil and 7% solar and wind. And this is total energy, not just electricity. If I go to Russia, again, a big flattening there, but a lot of natural gas, of course, and starting to grow again. So you see only 36% coal and oil, tremendous amount of natural gas, and essentially no solar and wind in Russia yet. In South and Central America, a lot of energy growth, kind of flat in the last decade or so, but starting to come back, a lot of oil and natural gas. So you see coal and oil at 47% and at 3% solar and wind. In Africa, a lot of energy growth, a lot of coal and oil. In fact, it's 64% coal and oil today and 2% solar and wind. The Middle East won't surprise anyone. A lot of growth in energy, and it's all oil and gas. They've opened a new nuclear power plant recently, and they're looking at solar. 47% coal and oil, tremendous amount of natural gas, and no solar and wind yet. Finally, Southeast Asia. Look at the colors on the map. 1, 2, 3, over 4, plus or minus 4 billion people. We're not evenly distributed in the world today for sure. And here's the growing demand for energy in Asia. And look at the coal and the oil today. It's 75% coal and oil and 3% solar and wind. Now I'm going to shrink and grow these to be proportional to consumption, the actual demand. Here we go. That's how much is actually consumed, and they're scaled correctly. And what a change. Half the people in the world today live in Asia, and they get half of their energy from coal. So here's 2019. Now watch, I'm going to go back to 1965. Watch the change in this pie diagram. Here's 1965. It's largely coal and oil and some natural gas. Watch North America change from 2019 to 1965. There's the amount of consumption, and look at North America, a lot of coal and oil. Watch Europe, mostly coal and oil back in 65. Russia, again, coal and oil, starting their natural gas. South America, dominated by oil. Africa, coal and oil. The Middle East was all oil, just starting their natural gas. And Asia was all coal and all oil back in 65. And quite a big difference in demand now. When I shrink and grow those, look where the energy was being consumed. North America, Europe, Russia. Asia was just getting started. So that explains this graph. The change in demand for the different fuels across these 55 years or so, and certainly the growth and change in economic consumption from a Europe and North America to an Asia demand center. Now on a per capita basis, things look quite different. Energy per person. Here's North America, twice as much as Europe. Look at Asia. Per capita today, not much. Africa, essentially none. South and Central America, quite low. Russia, high. The Middle East, quite high. Both of those more than Europe on a per capita basis. So I just focus on Asia and Africa and South and Central America. Per capita, not much energy consumption yet. But if you look at the population of the world, there are 7.8 billion people in the world today. 77% live in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Over 3/4 of the world's population. And look at the per capita energy consumption on the right. This is the big challenge. As the population of the world begins to grow and industrialize, and the per capita energy consumption goes up so that we can create the wealth, it's going to take a tremendous amount of energy. What else is growing? We are, the people in the world. We're headed toward 10 or 11 billion people by the end of this century. Now, that's a lot of people. And who consumes energy? We do. This is correlation and causation. There's the different regions of the world. And if I color code those the same as the plot, you see Asia and Africa, 70% of the world's population just in those two regions consuming less than half of the world's energy. That's a great challenge. Here we are again, color coded by energy type. Again, who consumes energy? We all do, but a tremendous amount of coal, oil, and gas. And you'll hear the world could be wind and water, waves and hydro and tides and solar if it was just for political will. In fact, you're hearing that in our new presidential administration in the United States these days. What would that look like? By when? When could we truly be wind and solar and water? I modeled it out to 2065, 98% so-called renewable. Look at that. A lot of solar and wind and some hydro growth there as well. How does that look to you? Some are saying we should do that by 2040, in the next 20 years. I mean, that looks silly to me, okay? I'm sorry. It just doesn't look like it's even anything possible. Now, maybe it'll be 75% renewable. That's what this graph shows, or 50%. Growing up and falling down, maybe just 25% renewable. In other words, all the new demand represented by solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear. That would be called business as usual. Here's what that looks like. And again, these are 2016 data. I'm going to show you 2019 next. So how does that look? That's the so-called business as usual model. Let's look at that slightly differently. Let's look at the exact same data, but in a percentage. So here it is in units, and here it is as a percentage, okay, in 2016 data. Now I'll add 2019 on. Here's the most recent data. This was my 2016 forecast, and here's 2019. It doesn't change much, does it? A little bit of difference here in coal and oil, maybe a little bit in gas, more gas, etc., but not that much change. In fact, if you look at the left-hand side of this graph and the right hand, it was 78% oil and coal in 1965. On the right is 37%, half. Natural gas and nuclear double. Renewables go up 4 times, 6 to 25%. Is that business as usual? Those don't look anything alike from left to right, okay? And that's 25% renewable. That will not be easy. The global energy mix changes slowly. It's driven by market forces when something better comes along. So we change from one thing to another when something better comes along. We left whale oil behind when real oil came along, natural oil, okay? Now on the right-hand side of that graph, you'll see oil and gas. There's still a lot of it in that mix. About half of the energy mix, lower than today, but half of the mix in a growing demand. Where's it going to come from? This is the production of oil in the United States, and it was going down predictably and steeply up till about 2009, and our imports were going up along with it because our consumption didn't change in the United States. But something changed. Exports were essentially nil of oil, and then this happened, shale. The imports plummeted, the production doubled, and we started exporting oil in the United States because of hydraulic fracturing of shale. A remarkable change that nobody really saw coming, even though we were doing it in natural gas with fracking. Still, nobody really was predicting it in oil, but it happened. This is a deep set of studies the Bureau of Economic Geology has done over the last decade or more, a big team of engineers and scientists. We've looked at every single well and every single shale field that I'm going to show you for decline, 3D geo models, etc., extensive studies. And this is a summary. What you see in the large red circle is the amount of gas in place in the Barnett. And that little red circle, that's what's been produced so far by all of those wells, over 17,000 wells now, okay? Big circle in place, little circle production. Same scale, the Fayetteville, the Haynesville, and here's the Marcellus. Tremendous amount of gas in place and some production, remarkable, but not percentage-wise. Now we look at the oil basins, the Bakken, here's the Eagle Ford, and finally the Midland Basin. Not, just the Midland Basin. And here I'm showing the Wolfcamp A and B in the Delaware and Midland Basins both. Tremendous amount of oil in place and good production from that, but a lot still left. So when you start to think about this, 3 to 4% of the natural gas has been produced out of what's in place, and 2%, maybe approaching 3% of the oil now. It leaves a tremendous amount still there. Much of that will never come out. It's shale, but there's still more to get. That's the resource and the reserves. So what has COVID done to all of this? Well, I'm going to have a little COVID moment. Here's what face masks say about someone. Here's a healthcare professional with their N95 and a semi-professional. Here's a thrifty person wearing a scarf, handy with thread and needle. They made their own mask. And here's a bank robber. And here's somebody who probably shouldn't be allowed out of the house. Okay, so masks tell a lot about people these days. So what's happened with COVID? The rig count in the United States with COVID plummeted. Okay, it went from there all the way down to essentially, just under 200. Now it started to come back. When the rig count fell, so did the production. It went from 13 million barrels a day down to 10. That's a huge change. 3 million barrels a day decline in production as a result of COVID. But the rig is coming back, and you're starting to see the production respond. How about demand? Interstate highway traffic? Well, here's the cars. They plummeted, but look, it's already back up to just less than 10% of where it was. In fact, the trucks are higher than where they were because we're all home getting stuff delivered to us by Amazon. So let's come at a couple other key transportation indices. There's the vehicle miles traveled. They dropped tremendously, and then they've been coming back steadily. That's the price of gasoline. It's still low, but coming up with the price of oil. Here's the sales of cars and light trucks, plummeted, and now it's right where it would have been just less than a year ago. Now, air travel hasn't come back completely yet. It dropped tremendously. It's starting to come back, but people are still flying less. You're starting to see that change. So what does that do to world oil production and consumption? Well, COVID had a big impact on consumption. We shut down the global economy. So 103 million barrels a day down to 85, a huge change, but it started to come back. And of course, production followed that, laid down rigs, massive layoffs in the oil and gas industry. And where is it looking like it will head? Well, consumption, as I've shown you, is already coming back. Production will follow, but it lags because it takes a long time to bring that system back in place. When production lags consumption, guess what happens to price? Price goes up. And I've been talking about this throughout COVID now for several months, and price has followed that. So here's the price. Here's the Brent crude, the global standard. It's quite volatile. Look on the right end. We've now gone up to $55 a barrel just today. I just checked it 20 minutes ago. 55 bucks. How about investment in oil and gas? Everybody says it's dead. This is in trillions of dollars in the upstream. You think they're related? I mean, the price goes up, investment goes up, price down. These are so tightly correlated. And guess what's starting to happen with an increase in price? And the demand for liquids still there. Okay. COVID-19 is going to change some behaviors in the developed nations. We understand we can work from home. We're rich. We have computers and internet that's stable and electricity and delivery trucks from Amazon. But a lot of the world doesn't have that. So it's not going to have a lasting global impact on 70 to 80% of the people in terms of the energy mix. Now, if there's another round of COVID, a stronger virus, more contagious and more deadly, we'll see that lasting longer. But again, the permanent changes aren't great. So another little COVID moment. Sit, they say to the dog, and the dog, damn mask, you can't understand anything. And I can relate to this because my wife and I just got a new little puppy, our second, this is a little hunting dog, and we've had our moments like that as well. But this is what 2020 reminded me of. You know, I'm so glad that 2020 is over, and you probably feel the same way. Let's have some fresh air in 2021. Let's talk about electricity now, okay? Affordable, reliable, environmental. Remember the pillars of security, of sustainable energy? Affordable, reliable, environmental. This is generation fuels for electricity by source, not total energy. This is electricity only. Coal continues to rise, starting to plateau a little bit, oil down a little bit, and look at the natural gas growing for electricity generation. Nuclear has grown some globally. Hydro has grown quite a bit. There's solar, wind, and everything else, showing you the Great Recession. Electricity has grown 271%. Now, only a few things have grown more than that. I'll remove those that haven't. You see natural gas, a lot more. And then the solar, wind, and hydro, or biofuels and other things, tremendous amount of growth because it was essentially zero back in 1985. This is just back to 85. Now, by region, we see North America and Europe, again, flat for a couple of decades. Asia gone up tremendously in electricity. And the rest of the world, not that much yet. Again, the 271% growth. North America and Europe are much lower than that, with Asia being the only region that's grown more than the global demand, and by a lot. By country, you see China consuming the most electricity in the United States. This is back in 2012. And now I update to 2018 data, and you see China's electricity demand continues to grow tremendously. India, the US has grown a little bit. Who's missing? I've got a gap there. Who's number 3? It turns out it's the technology sector. Technology consumes more electricity than any nation except the United States and China. Just look around. You know, young people and kids are on phones, and this is our daughter's soccer game or her football game. Everybody was on their telephone. There's a game going on. Here's the cloud. You know, technology consumes 4% of the world's electricity today. And the tech center is producing about 400 million tons a year of CO2 emissions. It's no wonder they call it a cloud. They probably didn't mean to. Looking back, they might have chosen a different name. But it's a huge challenge in technology. So if you look at generation, I mean, Bitcoin requires a tremendous amount of technology. Electric vehicles. So if we start looking at what generates the electricity, here's coal. That's North America and Europe, down tremendously. Grew and built the economy on it, but have come way down. Asian coal is just gone nuts. 120 gigawatts of power under construction today. And yes, a lot of wind too, 23 gigs, but that's just a sixth of what they're doing in coal, a fifth to a sixth. And the rest of the world's coal combined is essentially not noticeable. Okay. Now I'm going to put natural gas on top of that at the same scale. Here's the natural gas consumption. You can see on the right end, natural gas is growing everywhere in the world. Unlike coal, which is mostly growing in Asia, natural gas is growing everywhere. In fact, when you look at a gas to coal ratio for power, it was 38% in '85, it's 62% today, and growing. And that's a good trend. Nuclear fell with Fukushima Daiichi, the great disaster that wasn't really a nuclear issue. It was a tidal wave and a giant earthquake, but nuclear fell, but it's right back to where it was. And that's mostly coming from Asia. China's building over 50 new nuclear power plants today. Hydro has grown tremendously. Look at Three Gorges, the largest power plant in the world in China. That happened where I've shown it. And Asia, again, North America and Europe flat, but everybody else are growing their hydro. And then solar and wind have grown exponentially combined, and you can see that here. Tremendous growth in solar and wind. Now, data must be used to tell the truth, not to call to action, no matter how noble the intentions. If you haven't read this wonderful book, Factfulness, yet, I encourage you to do that. I pulled this quote out of the middle of a paragraph near the end. Remarkable discussion about 10 things that are better than you think with a tremendous amount of data. So we come back to telling the truth. Here's global electricity generation by source, as you've seen. And I'm going to lay solar and wind on top of that. So you will hear, your kids will learn that solar and wind are the fastest growing source of electricity. They are, in terms of rate. And you can see that here, the growth in rate against the global growth. But what's that not telling? What about in actual units? So let's scale these the same. Remember, it's right there in the data. For 15 years, we've built the best solar and wind resources first. That's the growth. Now, the growth in demand for electricity across those same 15 years is almost 8,500 terawatt hours. That's the actual generation, not capacity, the generation. 8,500, that's the growth wedge in 15 years. And solar and wind have made up for about 25% of that, okay? 75% have come from other things. So less than 75% of the growth alone, not even what's already there, since 2005. So the rate matters, but so does the actual generation, the actual units. And then you'll also hear that solar and wind are now cheaper than coal and natural gas. Well, they are in many places at the plant gate, at the generation source. But what about to the consumer? What's not included in that levelized cost is what it takes to back them up. Because they're intermittent, and that will never change. There will always be night and clouds and non-windy times. So you always have to have an equivalent amount of redundant backup on call to make electricity reliable. And that redundant backup is very expensive. That's why California and the Northeast pay more for electricity by 2 times than other states in the country, gray being the lowest and red being the highest, all right? and so does Germany. So solar and wind are intermittent, they require backup, and they're less affordable to the consumer in most regions. That's the truth to the consumer, okay? Let's talk about the environmental impacts now. Atmosphere, air, land, and water. Here's CO2 emissions in the world. And the size of the rectangle is proportional to the amount. You see manufacturing and transportation, heating and cooling, and power generation. And then finally, forestry and ag, which isn't talked about, but it's almost as much as power generation. So that's it. That's the different sectors of human-caused CO2. Now, we don't focus or talk much about half of it. We don't talk so much about the manufacturing, heating, and cooling, and the ag. That would require efficiency and processes, improved processes, insulation, lighting, agricultural practices, the things that are happening to reduce those emissions. We do talk a lot about the other half, power generation and transportation. We've talked about power gen already, and here we show again primary energy by region. You can see what we've looked at before with Asia being very high. In fact, if you go from this now and ask, well, what are the CO2 emissions from that? Here's the plot of CO2 emissions in the world. And it's really an Asian story and a North America story. They account for quite a bit of the emissions for CO2 today. Why is that? Well, here's your emissions across the bottom, CO2 emissions, 35 billion tons a year. And this is against a ratio of consumption and production. So that dashed red line in the middle, if you're above the line, you're consuming more than you produce. So the United States produces 5 billion tons of CO2 every year, and we consume more stuff than we produce. China produces 10 billion tons, but they produce more than they consume. Now, the non-OECD, the non-wealthy nations in blue, a lot of those nations produce more than they consume. In fact, the world has shifted manufacturing to the non-OECD. The rich nations, the green ones, most of them consume a lot more than they produce of stuff. So the producers are sending stuff to the consumers, okay? And in effect, what's happening? Well, the consuming nations are effectively saying, hey, producers, you emit the CO2, and we'll pretend like we're green, okay? This is very strange. We're effectively sending CO2 emissions. Now, when you talk about zero emissions, is that really a solution to have somebody else make your stuff? How many atmospheres are there in the world? There's one. There's one global atmosphere. If China makes our stuff and produces more CO2 per unit product than we would with heavier regulations, does that help climate change? No, it doesn't. Good intentions, perhaps. These people had good intentions. They were putting in posts to keep someone from parking next to the building, but they forgot where they parked, okay? They can't get out, and regulations often do that too, and governments, they have these good intentions, they put up the posts, but they sometimes forget where they park. So when you look at coal consumption in the world today, that's the United States. It grew and has been coming down tremendously because it's wealthy. India has now passed the United States in coal consumption. This is actual consumption. And here's China. Now look, I mean, there's no comparison anymore. Now China and India have the same population. India is about 3 decades behind China, 2 to 3 decades behind China. Look at the slope of the orange and the red line. What's India going to do in the future? We don't know, but it'd be nice if they could substitute something for coal. Now the emissions from coal in China look like this. Again, 7 billion tons a year just from coal. Natural gas in China look like this, all right? Not much because they don't use much. It's 11.8 coal to gas emissions in China. The rest of Asia, non-China Asia, produces a lot of coal emissions as well, and some natural gas. It's a 3.2 coal to gas ratio. And in the US, our coal has gone way down. Our natural gas past coal, we're a 0.6x coal to gas, okay? That's a huge difference, 0.6 versus 11.8x coal to gas ratio in those 3 nations. Let's look at it graphically. Here's the coal emissions across the bottom, and the natural gas emissions up the left side, a cross plot. There's China. A lot of coal, not much gas, and started increasing its gas. Now, these are on a log scale. Here's the rest of Asia, and there's the U.S. Kind of a crazy-looking plot. Again, China is 11.8x, Asia 3.2, the U.S. is a 0.6 coal-to-gas ratio. Now, we had coal policy under Jimmy Carter in the 70s. We were going gas, 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 and then they got worried about security with the first Arab oil embargo and pushed it to coal. And then later, because of hydraulic fracturing, it came back away from coal, right back to gas or where it would have been. Quite fascinating. Okay, that's policy driven. What you see, if you could shift from the same ratio, coal to gas, that's in from China to the U.S., you would see a reduction of almost 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. And I just did a lot of work over the last month or two to get these numbers figured out. You'd lose 5 billion tons in coal, but you would add 3 billion tons from natural gas. So that's about a 2 billion ton difference just from fuel shifting from coal to natural gas in the power sector. The rest of Asia, you could see another billion ton reduction, 2 billion down in coal, up 1 billion in natural gas. And the global effect of that would be a decrease of almost 3 billion tons of CO2 per year, an increase or a decrease of 3.5 billion tons of coal from the power sector, and an increase of 76 trillion cubic feet of gas. It takes a lot of gas to replace that coal. That's a lot of work to do if that's going to happen. But something in there is a very fast and efficient way to lower CO2 emissions quickly. So how do we reduce CO2 really? Natural gas, replacing coal. And if you could capture the carbon off the natural gas, even better. Nuclear, no emissions. Coal with CCUS, if you could capture the carbon from the coal. Geothermal and hydro, if you have it. Centralized wind where you have it, like we have in Texas, a lot of wind. And then distributed renewable energy. Okay, these are the big wedges. And the biggest by far are those first three. Natural gas, replacing coal, nuclear, and capturing the CO2 emissions. It's interesting, isn't it, when you hear people who are very passionate about climate change, they don't really talk about natural gas, nuclear, and coal as a solution. They're down here in these other things which are much smaller wedges and going to be very difficult to implement in the time frames needed. Finally, efficiency and conservation. Can we do more with less? That reduces CO2 as well. So the CCUS part of this is interesting. If you look globally, there are only a few big offshore CO2 projects right now. They're shown in these blue triangles. But there's a remarkable amount of potential. 50 billion tons of potential storage just from enhanced oil recovery in the offshore. 50 billion tons. A lot of that's in the Gulf of Mexico, and here's Maracaibo. Almost 5 billion tons, okay, of EOR potential. Now, the biggest EOR from CO2 in the world is the Permian Basin. That was only 0.6, less than about just over half a gigaton, all the CO2 EOR done there with natural CO2 so far. And some of that was sequestered or retained. So these are very big numbers. A lot of EOR with CO2, and then a lot of brine storage offshore as well. On the transportation side, then, what's going to happen? This is an electric vehicle. It has a license plate that says electrons on it. It's being charged with electricity that's being generated by diesel. You know, those are diesel generators. You can't make that up. Using diesel to make electricity to charge a battery is not particularly efficient or green. It turns out there's some irony there because the world is doing some similar things. These are the total electric vehicles in the world. We're up to about 5 million electric vehicles in the world today, and those have been growing steeply. Now, that was 2018. The forecast for exponential growth would have taken it well over 10. In fact, it's at 7.2 in 2019. As most things do, they grow exponentially when they're small, and then they start to go linear. And you can see that here. This is the addition of vehicles at 1.9, 2 million in the last couple years. That's great. 2 million vehicles a year, electric vehicles. And that shows you the purely electric. The other ones include some hybrids. So there's our electric vehicle stock. The critical thinking question is, are China's electric vehicles clean? If you look here, China in the light blue and the dark blue is almost half of all the EVs in the world. Almost half. And China charges those with mostly coal. 2/3 of the electricity comes from coal. That's not clean. It matters where you get your electricity. I don't have any accurate numbers. I just made this one up. Studies have shown accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. How many studies showed that? 87. So, you know, forecasts are interesting. They're not usually very accurate. Here is the Bloomberg forecast. It said we were going to go, it says we're going to go from today to 60 million vehicles, electric vehicles, every single year. We're making about 2 million today. Here's the actual. I'm going to scale the actual to this forecast. Remember, scale matters. So here's 2 million, and there's where Bloomberg says we're going to head. A remarkable amount of growth in the world for EVs, from 2 to 60. The area under that curve, if that happens, is 600 million new electric vehicles. That's half of the world's present-day vehicle fleet, about 1.2 billion today. So half of the world's cars would be electric by 2040. And that's without any growth. What does it take to make 600 million vehicles? How many batteries? Well, it turns out in one Tesla S, that's the nice big electric vehicle, the Tesla S, a beautiful car, there's over 7,000 batteries. 7,000 lithium-ion batteries. They look like this. They're bigger than your cell phone in one car. So I'm going to do some arithmetic. 600 million vehicles times 5,000 per car is 3 trillion new batteries. 3 trillion to electrify half the world's vehicle fleet. If we were to cover a U.S. football field in Tesla S batteries, it would take 2.7 million without any space. Let's start stacking them. They're about an inch tall, an inch at a time. So there's 2.7 million. We're going to stack them an inch at a time. They leave the football stadium. In fact, they go up past Mount Everest, through clouds to beyond spy planes into the stratosphere. Almost 30-kilometer solid tower of new lithium-ion batteries to electrify half the world's vehicle fleet. And then they wear out, and you have to do it again. The Tesla owner says no oil on their license plate in Colorado. I guess they don't have tires made of rubber or plastic. But it may as well say mining, because that's what's going to happen if we start to electrify the vehicle fleet at scale. And where does all that material come from? The earth. Rare earth exports. This is China and the rest of the world. China dominates in rare earth exports. Here's battery mining. This is the rare earth elements in the world. Here's the lithium, and there's the cobalt, thousands of tons. And here's the cost. They've been going up. They're volatile for cobalt and lithium for sure. And who owns all that? Well, China. China controls 60% of the world's lithium and 70% of the world's cobalt. Only about 15% of the world's nickel, but growing. And in terms of solar panels, which require polysilicon, China went from nothing 15 years ago to over 50% of the world's polysilicon today. The reality is that China is controlling the world's battery minerals and renewable minerals, solar and wind panel. We're moving from OPEC for transportation to China. And that may be okay, but you at least have to understand you're doing that to determine if it's secure. And how about human rights? China's mining practices violate human rights with children for the most part. And that's not something I'm sure that we want to continue to promote. So solar, wind, and batteries require mining, manufacturing, and landfill disposal. They have significant environmental impacts, security of supply, and human rights challenges. They're great for some things, but it's not a clean and dirty, good and bad scenario, So let's start to wrap it up. Energy underpins the economy. We've seen lots of data there that I've showed you today. And the economy allows you to invest in the environment. I've been in 65 countries. Here's a reasonably typical slum, and these are young girls, it turns out, coming home from school across just a massive garbage. The water is polluted, the soil is polluted, the local air is polluted. Without exception, the countries I visited where it's poor have tremendous environmental damage. They can't afford yet to clean it up. They have to create some wealth and some regulatory systems. If you look at the world's air emissions, the cleanest air is where it's wealthy. Remember the wealth, the blue circles? The greens and the yellows are where the wealth exists, except for Saudi Arabia. And then where is the air dirtier? Where it's poor. Okay, again, it's the challenge of cleaning it up. It takes a lot of wealth, developed economies, regulatory systems that are enforced. It's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. This is so important to have critical conversations and civil conversations, but we don't have to accept them, but we have to have them. We have to think critically. Okay? This is not critical thinking. This guy, which end goes in first? Oh, the boat. We need to think about things critically. The current narrative says, at least in the U.S. and Western Europe, that solar and wind are renewable, clean, and good, and fossil fuels are non-renewable, dirty, and bad. Critical thinking says no form of energy collection is renewable. The sun and the wind are, but the turbine blades and the panels and the batteries, they're not renewable. You have to mine them and manufacture and dispose them and do it again. All energy has environmental impacts. And they're not clean. They're just different. Okay? So we have to think critically about these things. The concept that we will take the world's energy, and now you know why the lights are on now, because there's energy there. Look at the consumption and where the lights are off. The concept we're going to get rid of all of the oil and gas and coal and nuclear, what's left? Is Russia going to do that? The Middle East, Africa, South America? Look at Southeast Asia. What's left? Even Europe and North America. Okay? You get rid of close to 90% of the world's energy. Let's just darken the lights on the world 90%. How does that look to you? Is that sustainable? Is that good? That's the past. That's not the future. Let's turn the lights on. Okay? Energy addresses hunger, clothing, shelter, clean water, fundamental human needs, education and healthcare. I can go to school when the lights are on and read at night at home, and refrigeration for vaccines. Women go for the wood and the water, and they cook indoors. They are differentially impacted by energy poverty. Immigration and migration, away from where the autocrats are controlling countries and there is no hope. Population is tied directly to education, closely and directly. Education reduces fertility rates. Environmental investment, I can afford to invest in the environment when I have a healthy economy. And finally, adapting and mitigating climate change. It takes all these things, and those take energy. You bring all that together, and you have something that changes the world. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, is change and improve the world. Global sustainability has to seek secure energy and healthy economies and environmental health, and mostly in that order. Several billion citizens lack access to energy. The major forms of poverty are access to electricity, cost of electricity, and clean cooking. Emerging and developing economies are using coal for power in unprecedented quantities. China consumes more coal than the rest of the world combined today. But they need to. They have to. They can't afford not to. Dispatchable options are natural gas, nuclear, and hydro. They're always on. Those are the baseload dispatchable options to coal. Focusing on fuels on behalf of climate change, I don't have a good word for that. Is it misplaced? Is it naive? Is it unworkable? Is it incomplete? Is it political? It's probably all of these. It's something, okay? Instead, focus on reducing emissions and minimizing the environmental impacts of all forms of energy, not the fuels. The fuels are required to come to healthy economies. Here we sit with our 3 E's in the radical middle. Sometimes it feels like that middle is shrinking. It's polarized, at least in some parts of the world, but not everywhere in the world. Some parts of the world it's growing. They're excited, getting educated, getting some energy, starting to develop systems and infrastructure and grow into wealthy nations. Reduce the impacts of all forms of energy on all forms of the environment. End energy poverty. Build a global economy. Clean up coal and oil for sure. Coal to gas. Carbon capture, efficiency. Nuclear, hydrogen, geothermal where you have them. Distributed renewables where those are available for the billion people who have nothing today. Again, I bring all that together. That's sustainable energy. It requires nonpartisan energy education and critical thinking. And that's what we're trying to do at the Bureau of Economic Geology, the research that underpins those things. And that's what we're doing at the Switch Energy Alliance in terms of education, is trying to make those materials available to you. So thank you, Enzo, Carlos, and I'm happy to engage in discussion now.
Many thanks, Scott. Great presentation as always. For the audience, and if you don't know, many of the presentations that Scott had done, and he usually updates the website, and he's showing on the screen. You can see a variety of presentations that goes along with the one you just saw today. Excellent, Scott. Thank you so much. And I want to kick off maybe with something that I know you have been working hard since I know you from the Bureau. Like, one of your key things I remember is emphasizing on how, as a scientist community that we are and belongs to, we communicate to the open public, right? And sometimes feeling like we're failing to really communicate what we know. And sometimes it's like politics and people with other flags take advantage of that. That's the kind of mainstream. So taking that into consideration, I would like to ask you, from the scientific point of view, do you think we have consensus about if we have transgressed some boundaries, some planetary boundary limits? We shouldn't be, limiting our activity somehow, because definitely we have gone too far. We should be revisiting the way we do things, and in particular in our industry, the hydrocarbon extraction industry, because mining will be another extraction industry as well. What kind of things do you think really we need to focus on in the next 10 years to do better?
Yeah, there's a big philosophical debate in many of these things about limits to growth, Malthus, and population, and if you go back through the years, there have been a series, one sector of people that is very concerned that we have exceeded our capacity, and in fact, it started over 100 years ago. 1 billion people was going to be too many for the world to sustain. We were all going to die, and we're at 7.8 billion today. So it turns out I'm not in that camp. I'll just be very clear. I think we have to be thoughtful about it. But technology has allowed us in many ways to feed the world in ways we couldn't dream of in the past. Better farming and agricultural practices. We've been able to create electricity and energy at scales we never thought possible, again, with dense energy. Nuclear is a part of that. Natural gas and hydrogen, even liquid fuels, are very dense. And so when you start thinking about cities where people are migrating today, like over 100 million people a year move to cities, they're very dense, so they require dense energy. I don't think that we have exceeded our capacity of the human carrying capacity of the world, but we have to be intelligent about where we head in the future. If we try to go back to an agrarian economy where everybody grows their own food and creates their own energy somehow, we lose all the efficiencies of dense things. Okay, so I don't think we can do that with solar and wind. I think that that would be a true statement in that case. I think you have to have denser forms of energy in order to be able to do that. And with dense energy, you use fewer materials, and then with wealth that comes from energy, you clean them up. We recycle, we reprocess, we dispose of them correctly, we regulate that, and enforce the regulations. So again, the reason the air is the cleanest in the nations that consume the most energy is because it's wealthy and they regulate that. Okay, that energy economy environment triangle is vital. You can't skip any piece of it. And that's what I think many who perhaps oversimplify that quite a bit by saying we got to get rid of these things or we're all doomed. In fact, the data show quite the opposite. That's why I recommended that book by Hans Rosling, Factfulness. It really truly shows these 10 big trends in the world that are better than you think and rigorous with data. And there's a wonderful website associated with that updates the data all the time.
Thank you. So for the audience that is listening, I think we're going to have time to go and visit all the questions as you have posted. So we're going to be visiting those questions soon. Gabriel, the another moderator, has a question already. So let's go with that one. Then we can go. I think I remember seeing a couple of questions that we can address together. For example, probably next on the turn it will be Maria Angela Capello. So you can be next on the line, Maria.
Scott, again, thanks for an enlightening presentation, no pun intended. You touched a bit towards the end on the above-the-ground risk of the energy transition. I think that the Renaissance project in Ethiopia is the latest example of how hard it is to scale up renewables. How do you see this potential bottlenecking affecting a realistic energy transition timeline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that general observation. And we featured the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in Switch On. I don't know if you had a chance to see that or others, but it's a remarkable project. One of the largest dams in the world now, and 6.4 gigawatt nameplate capacity. That's phenomenal. It's like 6,000 wind turbines equivalent generation. Huge. And Ethiopia did that in order to provide electricity. It'll electrify about half of the citizenry in Ethiopia, and they have about 100 million people. So 50 million people, at least at current consumption rates, and they'll sell some to neighbors as well, bring in revenue, etc. Now, it's not without political impact. They're a very big concern. It's on the Blue Nile River that flows north, merges with the White Nile into Egypt through Sudan, and Cairo, Egypt, has threatened to bomb Ethiopia. Initially it was a lot of unrest. The balance of power is changing. They're having still quite a deep discussions about all of that in terms of resource use, and that's what happens. But again, as compared to the project we did where we brought first solar to Gunchukwa there in Colombia, and that was a 3.5 kilowatt array, and that powered 7 mud huts, and that cost us about $100,000 when it was all said and done to bring all that with the people and the equipment and the installation and all of that. So a very different scale compared to the dam. But on the other hand, there's no infrastructure in Gunchukwa. There's no roads or power lines nearby or pipelines or rail lines or anything like that. So that's the only way to get electricity there. And so these are the challenges, is really trying to understand what is needed for the current situation and then to evolve and grow that as you go forward. And that's one of the great challenges, I think, is if you look at the transition, you see that I define that quite differently. I defined it as requiring a healthy economy, lifting people from poverty, and minimizing impacts of all forms of energy on all forms of the environment, not just the climate. That's important, sure, but the local air, the water, and the land. So when you try to optimize on land, air, water, and atmosphere, it leads you to different directions in a successful transition than just the atmosphere. If we just go after CO2, we're going to have a lot of negative impacts on everything else. We can do CO2 and other things. If we only go after the environment, then you have these big economic impacts, trillions of dollars, where in fact you have to have that healthy economy to afford that. That is the transition to me, as optimizing on the 3 E's, and it's different from others who think it's going away from coal and oil and gas to solar and wind. And until we do that, we're not successful. That will be unsuccessful. That will have a devastating effect on the economy, a devastating effect on the environment. It's part of the solution. It's not the solution.
Okay, Mariangela Capello, if you can hear, you can open up your mic.
Mariangela stepped away to another webinar.
Okay. Well, one of the questions, she was having two questions actually. One was related to the how you envision legislation related to the GHG, the greenhouse gases, to be applied equally worldwide, which is already a challenge, obviously, to apply legislation worldwide. But how you will see an attempt to go in that direction and considering all the consumptions and preferences per region about the energy mix.
So again, Enzo, the question is, how do we reduce CO2 emissions globally given the big regional variations?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I tried to address that, but let me try to kind of recap a little bit. By far, the biggest emissions today are from Asia. It's not their fault. They're making most of the world's stuff. We're importing everything from Asia today. More than 50% of the world's manufacturing is in Asia, and that requires a lot of energy. So in order to reduce those emissions, we need to encourage and facilitate a transition away from coal to natural gas, nuclear, and hydro, and then other forms of electricity that are dense and make electricity that's always on. So that has to happen, and the sooner the better. Vietnam, as you saw in Switch On, is about to build 50 new coal power plants in the next 20 years. Could they build natural gas? Could they build some secure nuclear? Could they add a little bit more renewable? What are their options? The second part of that is capturing emissions from coal, particularly because it's going to be there for a long time, and putting it away to store it, CCS. That will cost money. CCS, CCUS is a cost, but I think the benefits of that can be shown to outweigh the cost, particularly in some regions. Nuclear, we've got to think about that. China they're building 50 new reactors today. India hasn't yet. India has to. India can't go coal. They need to look at natural gas and nuclear for their dispatchable or baseload electricity, supplemented by renewable solar and wind and other things. So there are opportunities to do that. The United States, the UK, Germany, we're already reducing our coal tremendously, replacing it with natural gas mostly. I didn't show all that data today because that's kind of a U.S. focus, but the United States, you may not know this, we had something for Paris called the Clean Power Plan. That was going to be our power sector proposal to reduce emissions. It was a 32% reduction by 2030 was the proposal. We achieved that in 2020, 10 years early. We met our power sector reductions 10 years early in the United States. Okay, why? Got rid of coal, replaced it with gas, grew renewables in the States, maintained some nuclear. Okay, that's what technology did. So that's why I showed those graphs of the global change from a 0.6x ratio coal to gas in the U.S. to 11.8 in China. If you start to do that, you have a huge effect on the CO2 emissions. And I think that doesn't impede China's economic growth. China, look, let's be honest, that when the Chairman Xi goes to the UN and says they're going to become zero to no emissions by 2060, that's simply not true. In fact, it's silly. They're still building 120 coal power plants now. Those aren't going to go away in 40 years. They're 60 to 80-year power plants. And so the way it happens is by giving them options to do things, capturing that CO2 or nuclear and natural gas for baseload to replace that. They've already built a lot of their rivers hydro facilities. So the regional change is very important. No, different resources, different governments, different economic systems, different education levels. Those all play into regional transitions. We're making a third film, I'll tell you now. It's called Making the Switch. And we're going to look at exactly that. We're going to look at the regional transitions, probably 10 to 12 regions in the world that have similar circumstances, education, economy, resource circumstances, environmental and government, trying to look at those. And that's exactly what we're going to do to try to understand how the world will do this. But to oversimplify and say the world just needs to do this all at once is to underestimate the challenge. And in fact, then that won't happen, because a lot of those countries simply cannot afford to do that, and they will not do that. Okay.
So just looking at the time that we have remaining, we have about 10 minutes for questions before doing the closings. I will go through the list, but I see there is some gathering around the CCUS. That is when I see at least 3 people asking on that. So I want to give the last intervention to Tomás Mata. Maybe Tomás, you can read the question that Julio Herbas has in there. It may relate to yours, and you present both questions. You will be the last person to ask. Before you, there are 2 more. Then we're on the line pretty much. Herman Rojas, if you want to talk, and after Herman will be, I'm looking for the name here, but Herman, you can go ahead when I'm trying to find the other person named. Rafael Martinez will be following you. Try to limit the questions with the time remaining, about 3 minutes question and answers if we can.
Okay.
The CCUS question, I think, is important to have it on this discussion.
Okay. It's a great presentation, Tinker. I think it is a very, very revealing, excellent insight. I'd like to focus on the question of CCUS, because I see a lot, many councils and many things around hydrogen, and the blue hydrogen and the green hydrogen, but mainly in the green side. But as it is revealed in your presentation, this is a lot of buzzwords that are going on now. I think the world will need more energy to prosper. Now, CCUS, I agree that it is the great thing to really go on that more diligently. So what is being done? Because I see that it used to be a hot word, but now it is kind of lower the volume around the carbon capture, sequestering, and utilization for practical purpose or just for sequestration. What is your ideas on that?
Yes, your observations are exactly right. The volume used to be higher, then it lowered. It's back. The National Petroleum Council in the U.S. last year did a huge study on CCUS, very big and thorough, 500 pages, looking at the economics and the technology, et cetera. A lot of the big oil and gas companies globally, the international oil companies and governments, are now looking at CCUS, particularly offshore opportunities where the volumes are large, the government owns the minerals and the surface, the sources are close to the shoreline, there's infrastructure on the ocean bottom. So the technology is there to do this, Herman, but it's an economic challenge. Of course, it costs money, but there's some EOR potential. And then as these countries and companies, like the big tech companies, make pledges, they're pledging to lower their emissions. They can't do that with solar and wind alone because there's not enough. That I showed you the data. There's not enough there to do that. So they're going to have to buy credits from somewhere else, and that's a CCUS possibility or likelihood. So there's a revenue stream for those who sequester from those who are going to pay for their reduction credits. I think you're going to see it now really being at the forefront again. And there'll be some big major injection experiments, and hopefully beyond the prototypes into actually going to scale in the next 5 years or so. And we're trying to lead some of that in Texas. I think it's an important piece of the conversation for sure. It's only one of the wedges, but the reality is coal and oil and natural gas are going to be around a long time. We have to capture the emissions in order to reduce atmospheric CO2.
And that's where Venezuela will have another opportunity.
Venezuela has an opportunity. for sure. EOR opportunity with the CO2, the offshore opportunity there as well. So I think you do. You know, I think it is a good, like Texas, you know. Texas and Venezuela share some things in common. And that's one of them.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah.
Herman, you have a couple questions. Let's see if you can make it just one in this round.
Yeah, well, I will maybe appreciate your opinion about the battery future. What's going to happen with all the batteries that we will need for the electric cars? So do we need to improve those batteries, or we need to improve the recycling? So what is your opinion about the future in this point?
Both. We have to improve batteries. And interesting things coming out there. I just reading about a couple this morning that are going beyond lithium and cobalt. And we have to improve reprocessing and recycling for sure, but that takes energy. And then we got to recognize that if we're truly going to try to electrify the world's vehicle fleet, and we're truly going to try to back up solar and wind with batteries, chemical batteries, it's unfathomable. The amount of mining to do that is off the charts, okay? I actually don't think it will happen, because I think people are going to look around and say, where are all these mines coming from? I thought electricity was green. And they're going to realize electricity requires metals and elements and chemicals that come from the earth, just like anything else does. Nothing is free. So I think you're going to see some electrification, particularly of our gadgets, and maybe some vehicles, but probably less in backing up solar and wind and that kind of scale. It's just so big. Now, maybe pumped hydro, you know, a different kind of battery, not chemical. Pumped hydro, compressed air, advanced capacitors. Certainly, if you start to think about buildings, efficient materials, storing heat, these kinds of things could be good monitors, if you will, and geothermal as well. You know, geothermal energy. Hydrogen as a battery. Hydrogen fuel cells instead of diesel as a battery to back up. There's some quite interesting things there. What I think, though, in terms of transportation, is we're going to get back, just like CCUS, we're going to get back to looking at fuel cells again. Hydrogen fuel cells for cars, for transportation. And the source of hydrogen doesn't float around, is methane or water, but methane is easier. So I think we're going to start to see, coming into that transportation conversation, combustion engines, electric vehicles, and fuel cells. And some of the big automakers are already starting that conversation.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
Okay, Herman. So there were some questions regarding about CO2 and the way thinking CO2 as a cycle with the nexus and the other systems in the Earth. Usually CO2 is one of the inputs you need to do photosynthesis, so it should be good for the plant, so it should be kind of considered as a food for plants. So the question is more related about, do you think there is a more intelligent way of using the CO2 and regrow what we have deforested, I guess?
Yeah, that's happening. You know, as we increase atmospheric CO2 from 300 million to beyond 400 million ppm today, 410, 420, you actually see, if you look at satellite images of the Earth is greening. There is more food in the atmosphere, so plant growth is accelerating in many parts of the world today, particularly with ice melt. So whether or not you think that's good or bad, I'm not judging it. I'm just saying that's what's happening today. I think most are trying to keep natural CO2, whatever that means, in balance. So that would mean whatever we produce by combusting coal and oil and natural gas, we would put back and keep everything else in balance. Putting it back, for those who don't know as much about CCUS, most of it doesn't go into oil fields. That'll help, but it goes into the salt water in the pores. So it weakly carbonates salt water, like about your soda pop or less. So it's basically dissolved or trapped in phase into saltwater brine. And it stays there for a very long time unless you have a big earthquake or change the pressure temperature conditions somehow. So you've got to be smart about where you put it. Low seismic activity, and no big thermal changes. And then it will stay dissolved or in phase for thousands of years. And that's enough to get beyond the 100 to 200 year discussions that we're having today. Somebody asked something about exajoules. I'll just really quickly, I'm sorry to use that. You have to pick something. Just for so you know, an exajoule is about the same energy as a TCF. 1 trillion cubic feet of gas is about 1 exajoule, okay?
Okay. So one of the questions actually I saw in couple of the audience here was related to the trends that we're seeing in the oil and gas industry and companies kind of adopting some or diversifying the portfolio, adding more renewables, and taking some directions towards that, what the vision looks like towards 2050. Mm-hmm. Either being strong or moving in the direction like, you know, Europe SDGs and the, you know, 2050 goals, or, you know, a strong position about where we don't want to go that way, or a strong hold is in hydrocarbons. So what do you think is the drivers? What we can read about what's going on from the industry? And I want to extend that question a little bit more because most of the audience is actually from this industry. What do you think is the way for us to have control in that future? What we can do actively, actually, to feel like we are in control of these changes if it needs to happen, and how we become resilient?
Sure. Look, full disclosure, I sit on Shell's Science Council, External Science Council, the last 7 years. And I was on BP's for 7 years before that. So, you know, these companies, I think, are smart to look at increasing their optionality, their energy portfolio. They have to do that, not just for political and public reasons, but because diverse matters, okay? Now, hydrogen is a big part of our future. That comes from methane. CCUS is a big part of our future potentially. That's a subsurface challenge. It's a huge industry, moving more volumes of stuff than oil and gas coming out. Geothermal is a subsurface industry, right? You have to understand the system, you drill wells, you manage it, you have to move wells as the heat is depleted, etc. So there are a lot of things related to the extractive industries in the future solutions, in addition to oil and natural gas, which are a big part of the world's future still. Oil still for transportation with options coming, as I've discussed. Natural gas continuing to grow for lots of reasons, very versatile. So I think a company would be unwise to try to get rid of oil and gas from their portfolio. They just have to deal with the volatility of price. But it has economic upsides. And one of the reasons investment has gone away from oil and gas is because it wasn't making money. The price was low and the returns were not good. So they were looking for other investments. You start bringing profit back into the picture and investment comes back into that scene. I promise you it does. So that's the reality, I think. The other challenge, of course, is international oil companies and big independents have to compete with national oil companies. So a PetroChina and an Aramco and other national oil companies, they have their countries sitting beneath them. They get to develop their own resources in their own country. Nobody can come in there and compete with them. And then they come out in the world and compete. So it's not a level playing field. Let's not kid ourselves. There are some that are playing with the support of their governments and some that have to compete on their own. In fact, their governments are fighting them in the United States. You know, they're suing them. So it's quite an interesting challenge. And my final word on that is be careful what you ask for public. Because if you try to get rid of ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Total and Ovintiv and Equinor and I could go on, guess what? You're going to have a few oil and gas companies left in the world, and they're going to be very happy to come in and develop all of it. And the regulatory systems aren't as good as the ones that you know and are allowed to buy stock from. So you know, the concept you're getting rid of oil and gas because you get rid of some companies is misplaced at best. I think we ought to keep them as healthy as we can. We need them. We need you. We need PDVSA. You know, we need everybody healthy and doing their job so that the world can have the energy it needs to grow and industrialize and develop and invest in the environment. So those of you who work in the oil and gas industry, you probably don't get thanked very often, but let me thank you, okay? Thank you for what you do. We need you. Keep it up. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think you just pretty much used the right words to kind of conclude the space that we have, and we are very appreciative for the time you have provided today for showing us your vision, and obviously all this exposure you have had in your career, talking with too many stakeholders in this energy space, and give us really a good picture of what we need to be looking ahead of us. So we really appreciate your time here. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
For the audience here BAPA, we're going to continue talking about some activities that we have for 2021. One of those activities may relate actually with Scott and his Switch Energy Alliance. So we're very excited about that. But if you want to stay a little bit, we can talk about also what you learned, what would you like to hear next and during the program of this 2021 webinar. So definitely a lot more to come. So we can switch to Spanish anytime. And but thank you so much for all the audience visiting today. We can continue talking BAPA subjects now.
Yeah, well, let's continue in English because Scott is still here.
Yeah, I guess
I'll listen in if that's okay for a little while. I have another meeting in about 20 minutes, but I'm happy to listen in for sure.
No problem.
Okay.
Scott, I really appreciate your time, and I just wanted to make a small remark about the effort that we're putting into BAPA, Venezuelan American Petroleum Association, to include next-gen engineers, people that are working so that this energy transition happens, and it happens efficiently. I couldn't agree more with your remarks concerning the importance of the sector. The oil and gas sector has a significant role, and BAPA will continue to contribute as much as we can to put the word out there, and we really appreciate your support and your time.
Well, thank you very much. That's very nice. And go to the Switch On website. There are a lot of fun things there, materials, films mostly, to share with your students and your professionals and the public. And again, and then it's a not-for-profit. Anybody who has the interest in financially supporting that would be tremendous as well. I give my time and money to it, but we raise money so we can do what we do. So thank you very much for your nice remarks.
Let's do a subject in Venezuela for that movie. Maybe we can include a couple of the experts here. So Carlos, Eduardo, I don't know how do you want to take it from here? The audience is open.
Normally, after the presentation, we had an open section where people can ask, or comment on anything that they interest. I don't know if there's some people in the audience that like to comment about the presentation, or they have any concern that we could answer, and maybe because Scott's still here, he may help us to answer it, or he left already. No, he's here.
Well, he's around. He's at 20 minutes, but I'm not sure. I mean,
if anyone wants to make a comment or
Carlos, what I suggest is that you read some of the questions on the chat, because there are many questions in there.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
but I mean, what we try to honor is the time, space, and Scott made available for us. So it's up to him. If Scott, I don't know if you're listening, but it's up to you really if you would like to continue addressing some of the questions that we have still.
Do you have some few minutes to answer some additional questions?
Sure, I could do about 10 more minutes. I have to prepare for a 1 o'clock meeting, but I could answer a couple more. Absolutely.
Yeah, there was a question in the audience that I thought was interesting. It's about recycling. It said, would you please comment on ways to reprocess the battery material to avoid accumulation of junk that will be contaminated to the world environment?
Yeah. I mean, battery reprocessing and recycling it's a doable process, but it's not easy, and it requires energy. It requires facilities, and it's expensive. So the reality is most of our batteries are dumped into landfills because A, people don't take the care to take them to recycling facilities, and B, we can't afford to recycle most of it. It's cheaper just to get new mined materials than it is to try to extract those materials out of an old battery and put them into something new. That's true for a lot of things. It was true for, when we start thinking about weapons grade uranium, the U.S. was using mined uranium more than reprocessed and recycled uranium because it's just cheaper to do that. And so that's one of the challenges with batteries, I think, is the concept of recycling versus the reality of what actually happens, and particularly at scale. It's just not going to be an easy thing to do. Now, there are some technologies in batteries, different ions, different cations and anions, different metals. And also, people are working on solid-state batteries, which are very different technology. That could change a lot of things. It depends. But batteries have been around for a very long time, and they've gotten better. But advances are incremental. It's not easy to make big changes in battery technology. I just don't know that powering, it takes so much battery weight to run a vehicle because it's a low density form of energy. It's electricity, but the weight of the battery itself. So a battery pack in a car is between 400 and 1,000 pounds. It's like a combustion engine. The gasoline doesn't weigh as much, but the engine itself does. So you trade off an inefficient combustion engine for very efficient fuel, gasoline or diesel, with a very efficient motor, electric motor, and a very inefficient fuel, the battery. So there's pros and cons to both of those.
There is another question. I don't know if you can answer that. It's about what is your opinion about Thornton molten salt nuclear reactor concept currently being developed and evaluated by the government of Indonesia?
Yeah. Molten salt? Molten salt reactors? Is that what you said?
Yeah, molten salt nuclear reactor.
Yeah, look, again, there's a lot of advances in fission technology that are happening, and the reactors in the United States are old gen, Gen 1, Gen 2. France has a set of reactors that are kind of the same. They are able to manage those pretty well because they're all the same. But next gen nuclear technology, Gen 3, 4, 5, and I'm not even talking about fusion, if that ever happens, are much better. And so you see inherently safe reactors. You see those that are using their own waste internally. So you end up with a lower heat content and lower volume of nuclear waste than you would have otherwise. And of course, some of the most exciting technology, I think, are these small modular reactors where you're looking at a 20, 50, 100 megawatt reactor as opposed to a big gigawatt, so a 10th to a 20th size. They're not very big. NuScale, if you want to Google NuScale, NuScale is a company leading that out of Oregon. I know their CEO. I've spoken to their technology conference, and they've passed some regulatory hurdles. So you could put a 50 megawatt nuclear reactor that, again, is pretty inherently safe, low volume waste, always on electricity, very affordable once it's installed. You could put that in a set of villages, distributed nuclear reactor. And then you could supplement that with renewable sources of energy. And people go, well, that's crazy. Small reactors, I don't want them everywhere. We've had them for 60 years. They're in the oceans. Aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines run on small modular nuclear reactors. They float around and they get attacked sometimes. So, putting them on ground behind a big fence I'm pretty comfortable with that. I think we need to get past some of our, in my opinion, unwarranted fear of nuclear and the radiation that could come if it's not done well. It's a remarkably safe technology, and it's always on, zero emissions. Zero CO2, methane, or any other kind of emissions. You have to mine the materials for the fuels, for sure, but again, really high density forms of energy. So I think It's coming. It needs to. There are those fighting nuclear. There's another great book I'll recommend that you read. It's called Apocalypse Never. It's by Michael Schellenberger. Just came out this year. Apocalypse Never. And it's a very powerful read. Michael is a friend. He's a environmental climate science, environmentalist. He's passionate about it. He labels himself a climate alarmist. He worked in the Obama administration and Clinton administrations, and he's now written a book that has actually come around and said, look, a lot of these things that we were saying for alarming reasons aren't going to happen. They've never happened. We're scaring you for the wrong reasons. Here's the things that are important, but these things aren't. And he names names. He names names of all the people because he was in the rooms on that side. It's New York Times bestseller. It's a phenomenal read. It's highly referenced, 100 pages of detailed references for every sentence he writes in the book from something published. I highly recommend it. Share it with your families.
And to abuse of your time, a final question. In your opinion, in the last 30, 40 years, 50 years, the earth has become greener?
Has become what?
Greener, green, more green.
Green?
Yeah.
I don't use the word green or clean. I try not to use those words because they don't mean much to me. They mean something different to everyone. But I'll talk about it just from several big things. The emissions of CO2 have gone up, and the atmospheric CO2 has gone up. So it's up at 420 ppm or more. It's greenhouse gas. That's causing some warming. Okay, that has effects. They're not all bad, but some are. So whether that's green or not, so atmospheric emissions have increased, and it's causing some effects. They could be some significant negative ones. CO2 emissions in the atmosphere have caused, or food, so as I've already mentioned, plants have actually greened. They're getting more food. We're at one of the lowest CO2 times in the world's history, as you geoscientists know, even at 400 ppm. It's been 4,000 to 6,000 ppm in the past in greenhouse times, like the Cretaceous. So this is a very low CO2 time, and it's a very low temperature time. Even at today's temperature, we're very low. Most people don't understand that, but we're in a interglacial warming time, but this glacial, interglacial, very low times. Now, environmental impacts of energy more broadly. Ocean dumping has slowed by regulated nations, but there's still a lot of it. That's not green. Dumping plastics and chemicals into any water body is a terrible practice. We have to end that and recycle it. Dumping other things into the air from burning wood, that's not green. No matter what Europe says, burning wood isn't green. It's carbon, and it's very low density. So coal, particulate matter, and sulfur, SOx, nitrogen, and NOx, mercury, these aren't green. So we have to capture and put those particulate products away, those combustion products away, with coal and oil burning, and even some with natural gas, mostly CO2, not the SOx, NOx, mercury, and natural gas, very low for the most part, some sulfur. In terms of the water, again, ocean's terrible. We've done a good job in developed nations with our rivers and lakes. Didn't used to, but are now. Can do better. But a lot of the developing and emerging world isn't doing that, just dumping it into water systems because they can't afford otherwise. That's not green as they grow. And then the soils, again, we've got to clean up our mess and go to regulated landfills, capture the natural gas out of that. That's fine. It's a good use of natural gas. It's not going to change the world, but biogas is a good use of a reuse of a waste product. So we have to get the wealth into the hands of the world so that they can all do what developed nations have done. Begin to clean up their energy systems so that they can improve the environment. So I would say overall, there's been some greening, improved processes, But because the scale is higher of demand, that's a big challenge. Nothing's perfect. So on balance, we're probably some of both. We have a ways to go.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a lot for the additional time, Scott.
You bet. Happy to do it. And thank you for your organization. I really like what you're doing. We have several Venezuelans at the Bureau who left PDVSA. We may be about to hire one back, actually, and I have a lot of friends that I work with in state geologist ranks and other places who have this similar level of care for your country and for getting back the things that you know are possible. So I've only been to Caracas once myself, 2001, and things were really starting to change.
Yeah.
So I hope and will help you any way I can.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
we're looking forward for our relation about the future competition we're going to make together.
Excellent. Yes. And Enzo, if you would like to mention that, that would be terrific. I do have to run, but if you
Okay,
could mention the case competition, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
All right.